As the debate on the electoral reform moves to Lagos, the Nigerian Senate is pushing strongly to shift the burden of proof on the electoral empire. The Independent National Electoral Commission, contrary to the current arrangement that leaves the political parties and their candidates with a task in court to prove the credibility or otherwise of elections conducted by INEC. Arise correspondent Omo Bazwaye tells us more.
With barely 15 months to Nigeria's next general elections, lawmakers in the Senate have deliberated extensively on the proposed Electoral Act Amendment Bill 2025. For many, the Repeal and Reenactment Bill provides Nigeria yet another opportunity to correct the many flaws in the country's electoral system. In separate contributions, senators frowned at electoral violence and sought stiffer penalties for electoral offenders.
And this Electoral Act also seeks to regulate the conduct of party primaries, so that at the end of the day, the party primaries will also be done transparently and in accordance with the wishes and aspirations of the people.
Narrating how politicians procure AK-47 and other dangerous weapons to arm their thugs to subvert the will of the people, Senator Adam Oshomole explains that it's not enough to mount electoral reforms, calling on his colleagues to act the talk.
AK-47 is not like buying a car. Only big men have the money to procure it. And unfortunately, they seduce young people, weaponize their poverty, give them these weapons to fire at opponents and cause disruption so that they can write the result in the manner that they want.
To eliminate electoral fraud, many believe the solution lies in electronic voting. They called on INEC to deploy more technology while fine-tuning the lapses in BVAS and RF.
This is a turning point in our democracy. If we do not repeal and enact the Electoral Act, we will be faced with the incongruities in the existing Electoral Act.
Senator Danduse Mutari from Katsina South questioned an arrangement that allows defectors to switch party allegiance along with the mandate of the people.
Because you cannot be elected in a platform and then you'll be defected without exchanging a strict law that is supposed to be put in, because the mandate and the will of the people is being betrayed.
Equally profound is a call by Senator Siraki Dixon asking that the burden of proof and the credibility or otherwise of elections be shifted to INEC and not to political parties or their candidates in court. President of the Senate, Godswill Akpabio, backs Dixon's call.
The burden of proof in electoral matters, Mr. President, must shift to INEC.
We must give them some responsibilities in court to prove that, yes, indeed, their actions were legal and their actions were in tandem with the will of the people.
As the Senate shifts the discussion on constitutional review and electoral reforms to Lagos this weekend, the Electoral Act Amendment Bill 2025 is referred to the Committee on Electoral Matters for further legislative action. Omo Bazwaye, Arise News.
So joining us now on the show to discuss the new electoral bill passing second reading and the Senate endorsement is Samson Itodo, Executive Director of Yiaga Africa. Samson, great to have you again. A couple of questions. Number one, this burden of proof on INEC, will it solve a lot of...
Thank you very much and good morning.
Morning, Samson. Morning, Samson. Good stuff. So this burden of proof on INEC, will it solve many problems we have out there? Secondly, talk us through this, trying to shift election dates towards November that they've been talking about. Also, talk us through the use of IRF and the data center and the data coordination of the election, so we can authenticate that so that we can make it justiciable in court. Just 3 points.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning once again. So I'm currently in Lagos ahead of the retreat because I'm a member of the technical committee to review the Electoral Act. And some of the issues that you raised are the issues that will be discussed throughout the retreat on electoral amendments. So let's begin with the question about the burden of proof. Pretty much what the proposal is saying is that when there is an allegation of fraud or where there is questions as to the credibility of an election, the burden should not be on the litigant or the petitioner or the respondent, as the case may be, that the burden should shift to INEC. And the reason why this proposal is important, you see, in what we have seen over the last couple of years is a situation where someone feels cheated in an election. In fact, even when there is evidence that someone has been cheated and there's fraud, to prove their case, they need access to certain documents and materials that are in possession of INEC. And we've seen how there has been difficulties, and obstacles put in the way of litigants who want to ventilate their grievance, but they cannot access those materials. It's either you have other opponents or politicians deploying talks to disrupt the inspection process, or you even see a situation where INEC is reluctant to grant access, to those documents. So in this particular instance, if the burden shifts to INEC, INEC will now be compelled to say, okay, if you claim that you've organized credible elections, then come and prove it and establish that, yes, you have fulfilled all the conditions for the credibility of the election. So that's the whole proposal, and it enjoys wide support. The second proposal around shifting dates. Nigerians have been clamoring for an amendment to the Constitution so that all election disputes can be resolved before swearing in of a new or the winner of an election. And to do that, you have to alter the timelines, because the Constitution provides that elections shall hold not earlier than 150 days and not later than 30 days to an election. So there's about 5 months period. But when you look at the total number of days that is required for determining election cases, sometimes it spills over. You see situations where someone is already in office, they have access to state power and resources, and they can use that to influence judicial outcomes. And this is why this proposal, has been put forward. Therefore, you have to alter the timelines, and elections will now hold sometime around November or December, so that after the elections, between December or November to April, the matters would have been dispensed off with. And so whoever is assuming office can assume office without any distraction of litigation. And then the last point is about electoral technology. As you know, in the last elections, the IREV played a critical role. Unfortunately, the courts adjudicated and said that the IREV is not part of INEC's collation, a position that some of us don't agree with, because the INEC guidelines clearly make prescriptions on electronic transmission of results. But the courts have ruled. And what the Senate and the House of Reps have now done is updating the law in such a way that it takes care of electronic transmission and manual transmission. And the whole point is not to substitute one for the other, because technology does have its vulnerabilities. So you still need a manual transmission and electronic transmission to go hand in hand. And it's good to see, the senators debate this issue. Unlike the last time when there wasn't consensus, it was a tall order in the last National Assembly to even discuss the issue of electronic transmission. But it's heartwarming to see that these provisions are already contained in the bill.
All right, excellent. All right, I'm really, really glad about this move, Samson, and I'm also glad that you're part of the process, because you play quite a critical role and you've had the opportunity to observe a number of election cycles in Nigeria. The question I'd like to ask is on the independence of INEC, which has come up a number of times as being one of its bane and challenges they face. How will this new act, if passed, address that issue in terms of the process of appointment, not just of the INEC chairman, but also returning our officers across states, because he cannot work in isolation. Some of the challenges are even at state level in terms of the appointment of REC, who qualifies and who doesn't qualify. Then the talk around inclusion. How can we include more people, persons with disability, have more more people actively engaged and mobilized to register to vote, with the assurance that their votes will actually count for something. Some of the issues I'd like you to touch on this morning, Samson.
Like I've said previously, Ayo, the challenge of INEC isn't technical. INEC's biggest problem is political in nature, and it's about the political interference with the Electoral Commission. And I'll highlight a few areas where this really happens. Okay, when you think about the appointment process, it is a constitutional matter. There are proposals that the power should be removed from the president, which we strongly agree with under the new INEC campaign. I doubt, to be honest, that that particular provision is going to pass. The proposal that the power be removed from the president, I don't think that it's going to pass for very obvious reasons. In this presidential system of government, it will take a statesman who is a president to amend the constitution to reduce his powers. So I personally, I want the president and the National Assembly to shock some of us, but I am not optimistic that that particular proposal will sail through, as you can also see with the appointment of the INEC chairman, who we understand will be sworn in today and will assume office. But when you think about INEC's independence, the incoming INEC chairman who will be sworn in today has, if you follow his confirmation here, he talked about leveraging constitutional provisions and adherence to those constitutional provisions to protect INEC's independence. I think for some of the proposals in the electoral bill, yes, they strengthen INEC independence, but the bigger question is, one, when you think about INEC's independence, let's look at electoral procurement. Will the politicians allow INEC, to select the vendors that deploy materials and services to the Electoral Commission? Because politicians, we know, have some of these companies, they put a lot of pressure. So if you think about domain where INEC asserts its independence, that is one domain in the procurement of electoral materials. The second, when it comes to issues around results management, will INEC be shielded from every form of pressure from either incumbents, whether at the state or the federal level, to influence electoral outcomes? That is also the other issue. The third point, when you look at INEC's independence, is in the recruitment and the appointment of whether it's collation officers as well as ad hoc officials. We have seen cases where politicians recruit their adherents, to become ad hoc officials. These are domains, and where we will be watching the current INEC chairman is to see how he's able to assert the independence of the Electoral Commission and ensures all the other agencies don't assault or incur on the independence. For instance, the security agencies. INEC is not a security institution. If the INEC does not enjoy the support of security agencies, it's not going to make any headway with our elections. If INEC does not get the funding that it requires from the federal government, the next election is estimated to cost Nigeria over 870 billion naira. The big question is whether the federal government will release the money in due time, even though the Electoral Act provides that monies for election should be released to INEC 1 year before the elections. If you think about inclusion, part of the proposals, especially in the House of Reps version of the bill, is this point about early voting. Rufai, Ayo, and Vimbai, I don't know when was the last time you guys voted, at elections, because on the 20th of February 2027, you either be in the studio or you're covering elections. And that is not proper for a country that practices constitutional democracy. You have a right to vote. So media, security agencies, INEC officials are unable to cast their vote. So one of the proposals is to have early voting. When you introduce early voting as contained in the proposals, whether it's media and all those who are involved in election security or providing election services will be able to cast their vote at elections. So early voting is one particular way of deepening the inclusiveness of the electoral process. When you think about women and persons with disability, ensuring that, the entire party primaries are not structured in a way that they are determined by the highest bidder and the highest spender, that women and persons with disability and young people are able to secure party nomination. That is one aspect that requires a bit of deeper reflection and also proposal to strengthen that entire system so that this commodification or buying and selling that we see during primaries is reduced to the minimal level.
All right. Good to see you, my brother Samson, this morning. Now, while we're speaking on inclusivity, there's an amendment to proposed amendment rather, to section 12, subsection 1D and subsection 2, which is seeking to recognize the voting rights of inmates. Now, this is a contentious issue worldwide, but when we look at the peculiar issues we have here in Nigeria, are we ready to grant inmates the right to vote? How will that work? You know, we haven't perfected the logistics of, just ordinary voting before we now start saying we're introducing the prisons and inmates and, are we going to categorize which inmates qualify to vote and so forth? This particular part of the proposed amendments, what are your thoughts around recognizing the voting rights of inmates in Nigeria?
Thanks, Wimbai. I'm glad that really came up because that's one of the landmark proposals in the current amendment process. And I really congratulate, the two committees in the Senate and House for putting this on the table. A few weeks ago, Yiaga Africa with the EU hosted a technical workshop on this subject matter. The Controller General of the Nigerian Correctional Services, the outgone INEC chairman, and then members of the Senate and House committee were in that workshop in Abuja, where we unpacked this entire proposal. I think that the point that the incoming INEC chairman makes during the confirmation hearing, that no voter will be left behind, is very profound and instructive. There is no law in today's Nigeria that prevents inmates from voting. Whether there are 86,000 of them or even 100,000 of them in both federal and state prisons, there is no provision anywhere that hampers the exercise of their right to vote. So we need to look at this from a rights perspective, that these individuals are being denied a right that they have. The second point, when you think about logistics, quite frankly, what the proposal is saying is it's actually simple. The INEC will set up, in terms of voter registration, INEC will deploy, its officials to register inmates in the prisons, those who, are not registered, because some of them before being sentenced to prison, some of them perhaps might be registered voters, so there could also be a transfer of registered details. Before the election, every voter, every political party will have access to the list of registered voters in the prisons. In the same way, in today's Nigeria, every political party has access to the voters register based on the provisions of the law. Now, in polling units, INEC can create polling units in the prisons. In countries like Zambia, in South Africa, in Kenya, in fact, even in Ghana, these things happen, and it's just a simple process. You just adopt the same strategy and approach for the general voting for these particular special voting arrangements. And I don't think that logistics will pose any challenge. The bigger question is we need to recognize that people have a right to vote, and the right to vote is sacrosanct in a democracy, except if we say we are no longer a democracy or we are something else. But so long as we are in a democracy, the right of every voter is sacrosanct and it needs to be protected. So the burden is on the state to make provisions to safeguard the rights. That's why in other countries you have voting by proxy. We're not saying in Nigeria you should introduce voting by proxy, but it's to tell you how other countries cherish and value the right to vote. Right. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't, explore things like inmates voting and early voting.
Itodo. I appreciate your optimism, but you said all parties have access to the voter register. There was a report around, the charges of 1.5 billion naira to access it. So we wonder, how equal the access to the voter register is. But unfortunately, that's going to have to be a conversation for another day. Thank you so much, Samson Itodo of Yiaga Africa.